You know, an interesting debate all of a sudden popped up in my Twitter timeline. It was very weird yesterday and kind of into today even. Now even like several forums are talking about it, and this other Nintendo site. I bet you other ones will pick it up as well. But it kind of went crazy everywhere. And that was apparently a freelancer from IGN. By the way, it's not actually IGN, guys. Started talking about the Switch in a way that it's not as powerful as the 360 and the PS3. They kind of believe that the 360 and the PS3 is equal to or stronger than the Switch, and that was very interesting to me because I thought we talked about this before, but I went through my videos and realized I never really talked about the comparison between the two. But then when we did the Tegra video, I did kind of show the 360 next to it. I thought that was enough, but at this point I figure, let's go through it. I guess we could take a look to see, well, how strong it is compared to either of those two. Now, it's been pointed out to me by several people that, well, you need to be an insider to talk about this kind of stuff, and I don't think I'm really an industry insider at all, so I'm not really sure what I can do. If only there was a way. If only there was an edit button. Oh, there we go. And save changes. All right, we're good to go.
Let's start with the Xbox 360, since it's probably the easiest console from the last generation to understand. The Xbox 360 was released in 2005, and at the time was actually a pretty strong system even when compared to PCs at the time. Inside the system, it had a tri-core Xenon processor clocked at 3.2 GHz. Each core was outfitted with 2 threads, giving the CPU 6 threads total to carry out operations with. Paired with the CPU, an ATI Xenos GPU was used, clocked at 500 MHz. While this chip is custom made for the 360, many like to draw comparisons to the ATI X1900. If you look directly at the GPU, you will see 2 separate dies are included on top. The larger die is the GPU itself, while the smaller die houses 10 megabytes of EDRAM. This EDRAM is high-speed memory that is directly accessible by the GPU for things such as anti-aliasing that can be used without any penalty to overall performance. The Xenos itself as a GPU has a theoretical brute force maximum of 240 gigaflops. Located all around the GPU and CPU are RAM modules. These modules combine to equal 512 megabytes of GDDR3 RAM that can be used for either the CPU or GPU depending on how the developer wants to split it up. Having a large pool of RAM was preferable as you are not limited by set restrictions and can mold your game how you want, not how the system is set up. The overall bandwidth provided from the memory to the GPU is set around 22 gigabytes per second. To put in perspective how fast the EDRAM is, that is a bandwidth of 256 gigabytes per second internally. However, when actually transferring between that EDRAM die to the entire GPU, that number is heavily lowered to 32 gigabytes per second, which is still, of course, faster than the GDDR3 memory. Now, while we go forward here, keep in mind the 360 had a stronger GPU than it had CPU. This is going to be important to remember as we go over the PS3. Now, the PS3. Oh boy, this might get kind of confusing, and that's because of the cell processor. Even to this day, we don't know the full capabilities of this processor, and most of us believe it was never fully utilized. So here we go. Let's see if we can try to make sense of this chipset. We need to quickly go over the history of the Cell chip to better understand Sony's plan with the PS3. A few years ago, before the PS3 was revealed, Sony, Toshiba, and IBM formed the STI Alliance in order to develop a processor that could revolutionize the computing space. In 2001, the STI offices opened and work began on the Cell processor line. During this time, many patents were filed that included a rundown of how the chips being developed could reach a theoretical roof of 1 teraflops of brute force computing power. Different variations were created, with one, of course, going into Sony's newest console being developed at the time, the PS3. The original idea was that the Cell would be used for CPU operations as well as operations normally handled by a GPU. In fact, the original plan was for the PS3 to not use a separate GPU at all and only use the Cell. This unfortunately fell through and caused the PS3 to be delayed an entire year while they searched for a partner, which ended up being Nvidia. So what was the Cell exactly? Well, you may have heard people talk about how it is an 8-core processor, and while that's technically true, it's a little more complicated than that. At the heart of the cell is a PowerPC processor that calls all of the shots and manages other smaller processors known as synergistic processing elements, or SPEs. According to datasheets, there are 8 SPEs running in tandem. 6 are accessible and can be assigned tasks as needed. The 7th SPE is used for OS level operations and security, while the 8th SPE is used as sort of a fail-safe just in case something goes wrong with one during an operation. The cell in the PS3 can reach a theoretical maximum of 230 gigaflops, much higher than the maximum even of the PS4 and the Xbox One CPUs. So to summarize, there is one main processor at the top and 8 simpler processors that carry out tasks assigned to them from the main processor. Moving over to the GPU side, the PS3 used an NVIDIA chipset known as the RSX. The RSX sits at 500 MHz and has a theoretical performance of 230 gigaflops. The RAM situation in the PS3 is different from the 360's configuration. The PS3 actually has divided pools of RAM and even uses 2 different types of memory on the motherboard. For the CPU, XDR DRAM is used for the cell and is even clocked at the same speed as the CPU at 3.2 GHz. The RSX uses GDDR3 memory that is much more common to GPUs at the time. Each pool has 256 megabytes of RAM, equaling 512 megabytes total. You can probably already see why this might be more work for developers if they have to contend with 2 different types of RAM, but it gets even more complicated. See, each RAM pool has different bandwidths as well. The pool of GDDR3 has 20 gigabytes per second, while the pool of XDR DRAM has 25 gigabytes bandwidth. According to several developers and even Sony themselves, when the game starts, the GPU only has access to the 256 megabytes of GDDR3, which is an incredible drawback compared to the 360's 512 megabytes RAM pool. This is a reason why we never saw system-level voice chat for the PS3. Now, there have been talks from different developers about how they were able to pool memory from the system-level memory at times during the game, but this was not common for third-party developers who probably didn't want to spend a ton of time trying to figure out how to use system memory correctly along with the GDDR3 memory. It was much easier for them to port games over and just use what was there rather than try to spend time figuring things out. So now with the PS3, the cell is more powerful than the RSX from a technical standpoint, which is opposite of how the 360 components are ranked. Next up, we'll move over to the mysterious Wii U. I say mysterious because a lot of the information available now was gathered over periods of time from communities who were willing to dissect the chip. See, Nintendo never really told us what was inside the Wii U, and even to this day, there are arguments over how strong the system actually is. The CPU is a power-based chip named Espresso. This chip has 3 cores, and it clocks in at 1.24 gigahertz. It's believed by many that this chip is an evolution of the Broadway chip used in the original Wii, which does help explain the ease of backwards compatibility. The GPU is nicknamed Latte, which houses a GX2 core based on the Radeon R700 architecture, clocked at 550 MHz. Many compare the Wii U GPU to video cards from the ATI 4800 family. The Wii U houses 2 GB of DDR3 system memory, with 1 GB split to games and the other gigabyte split to system-level tasks. The Wii U has a memory bandwidth of 12.8 GB per second and incorporates 32 megabytes of EDRAM in a similar way to the 360. This 32 megabytes of high-speed EDRAM helps to alleviate bandwidth issues that the GPU would run into otherwise. Overall, the most common belief is that the Wii U has a brute force theoretical power of 352 gigaflops. The biggest drawback to the Wii U is by far its weak CPU, and this caused issues in several third-party games that were essentially bottlenecked by it. A great example is a game like Call of Duty Black Ops 2 that was shown to struggle heavily when compared to the 360 version, despite the Wii U having a stronger GPU and more RAM to pull from. Okay, now that we've quickly gone over the last generation systems, we can move on to the Switch. A quick spec rundown is pretty easy. The Switch is using a Tegra X1 that is nearly stock. I say nearly because there are a few minor changes that have been made. For one, the frequency of the Switch varies depending on if it is docked or not. When docked, the Switch GPU has a frequency of 768 MHz, and when in portable mode, drops to 384 MHz. Another change that was made for the Switch was the inclusion of an extra gigabyte of RAM. The Switch houses 4 gigabytes of low-power DDR4 memory that is accessible as one pool of RAM for the entire chip to use as needed. The memory bandwidth comes in at 25.6 gigabytes per second. Overall, with simple math, we can find that the brute force power of the Switch comes in at 393 gigaflops when docked and 196 gigaflops when in portable mode. And I know what you're probably thinking right now, those raw numbers for the Switch don't seem that much stronger than the 360, PS3, or the Wii U, and technically, you would be right. I think this is where many people immediately assume that the Switch is essentially a portable 360, but that assumption is very short-sighted as the Switch has a wealth of tools at its disposal that the older systems are generations behind on. Now, before we go any further, it needs to be said that the 360 and PS3 achieved some amazing visuals and games that would never be possible on a PC with similar specs. Developers really stretched those systems and continue to do so even to this day, but when compared to the Switch, they are vastly outclassed. I also need to say this comparison will be kind of hard to do since the architecture in the Switch is based around a GPU from 2014 and the architecture based around the 360 and PS3 is from 2005, but nonetheless, here we go. Now, there are a lot of improvements made in the last 10 years in video cards and their architecture. However, I'm mostly going to go over some of the changes that would more so benefit the Switch and its gaming capabilities. The one thing you want to remember here is video cards have become much more efficient in the way they handle processing tasks. The biggest glaring difference between the Switch and the previous generation systems is the difference in RAM. The Switch has several times more RAM when compared to the PS3 and Xbox 360 and twice the RAM of the Wii U. The RAM is also one large pool, making development easier than if it was split like the PS3. According to recent claims, the Switch uses 3 GB of RAM for the game and saves 1 GB for the operating system. Developers will of course use the RAM in different ways, but with such a jump from the 360 and PS3, gamers can expect higher resolution gameplay than what they would have seen in previous generations. The Tegra X1 is based on Maxwell architecture and because of this shares NVIDIA's end-to-end memory compression technology that is able to compact graphics data to save on bandwidth needed. The compression used is able to keep graphics data lossless when moving through memory lanes. The Switch also has twice as many ROPs as the 360 with 8 versus 16. A ROP is known as a raster operations pipeline and is essentially the last stop from the GPU to your screen. These units are used differently depending on the architecture and age of the card, but ROPs can control anti-aliasing as well as drawing the image to your screen. While more is better, it doesn't always mean less would necessarily bottleneck the system. However, in this case, more ROPs can only help the Switch. Overall, with the extra features available to the Switch when it comes to memory bandwidth working in tandem with the GPU, we can expect to see higher resolution images on the Switch when compared to the 360 and PS3 despite the similar bandwidth numbers. We have seen titles such as LA Noire already see a resolution bump from 720p to the last generation to 1080p on the Switch. Even going from a more current card in the Wii U to the Switch boasts better resolution with Zelda at 900p and Mario Kart seeing a bump to 1080p. Now, despite everything we just talked about, the biggest advantage the Switch has from last generation is that the hardware inside is very well known. The Tegra X1 is built around Maxwell architecture, something that many developers can become familiar with very quickly with dev kits and documentation having been available for quite some time now. The Switch also gains several engines that have now given native support. Think of Unreal Engine 4, for example, having entire settings built specifically for the Switch. The X1 also supports DirectX 12, OpenGL, and of course Vulkan. The 360 supports older versions of engines such as Unreal Engine 3 and DirectX 9. Older engines still work, but they are missing several graphical features that the Switch can now utilize for any developer as needed. Take a look at the difference here between the Switch and 360 version of FIFA. There is a massive difference here despite a small raw numbers power gap. Fortunately, at this point, you can just look at some of the games that are being released and the difference becomes clear. Skyrim is running at a much better frame rate and even includes effects found in the special edition. The last thing to remember here is the Switch doesn't have a bottleneck when compared to the Wii U. While the Wii U had a decent GPU for the time, it essentially used a triple-core GameCube processor alongside it. The X1 was built by NVIDIA from the ground up to be used in multiple devices. In fact, the Switch wasn't even thought of during the X1 development. What I'm trying to say here is the Tegra X1 is built to handle full OS features from something like Android or even Linux. The very fact that the A57 is comparable to the Jaguar CPU in much stronger PS4 and Xbox One consoles shows how CPUs are generally gimped alongside a powerful GPU to save money. Whether you want to believe Bungie or not, despite the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro having a strong enough GPU, the CPU is what's holding back the frame rate from being 60 frames per second. While I think there is an argument to be made that the Pro and X are being held back due to their weaker counterparts, Bungie themselves are sticking to this claim. So just remember, raw numbers are deceiving at times. You could lift weights all day and become extremely muscular, but if you have no no coordination, you won't be excelling at any activities that require that strength. The Switch is set up better than any other Nintendo system released in terms of familiarity with hardware and ease of development. Nvidia has created a chip that punches well above its weight, and new chips are being developed in the Tegra line as I speak. The line between home console and handheld gaming will continue to become blurrier, and in the distant future might not even exist. Above all else, enjoy your games and know the X1 is certainly more capable and better equipped than the previous generation consoles. Thanks guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing down below to keep up to date with any of these technology videos or of course any gaming news. Thanks for watching guys, I'll see you next time.